Before dawn, the general was already awake, not because alarms had sounded, but because the night itself felt restless. The air through the open window carried the smell of damp earth and distant smoke, a familiar scent in occupied France, yet heavier now, as if the land itself anticipated violence. He poured coffee, black and bitter, and studied the maps spread across his desk. Every bunker, trench, and gun position of the Atlantic Wall lay marked in careful ink. Months of planning promised certainty. Nothing significant was supposed to happen behind these lines without warning. The sky, however, had begun to hum, and certainty dissolved before the first report arrived. At first it was only a rumor passed by a breathless signals officer, a phrase spoken too quickly to be believed. "Parachutes," he said. "Many of them." The general frowned, listening to engines droning somewhere beyond the dark horizon. Parachutes belonged to exercises, to propaganda films, not to the heavily guarded rear areas of the wall. He stepped to the window again, straining his eyes against the moonlit clouds. Then he saw them, pale shapes blossoming open, drifting silently downward like seeds scattered by an unseen hand. The general's chest tightened. No invasion plan he knew placed men there, in that sky, behind those defenses. More calls came, overlapping, contradicting each other. One unit claimed dozens of enemy soldiers landing near a village. Another swore the fields were full of them, hundreds at least. A third insisted it must be a deception. Perhaps dummies, a trick meant to draw troops away from the beaches. The general wanted to believe that. He wanted logic to reassert itself, to turn this chaos into something manageable. Yet the sound overhead grew louder, engines passing in waves, and the pale shapes multiplied until the sky itself seemed torn open and leaking men. He grabbed binoculars and stepped outside despite the chill. The night was no longer quiet. Distant gunfire crackled, short bursts of panic, not organized defense. Tracer rounds stitched glowing lines upward, some striking silk and turning parachutes into brief, burning lanterns. He watched figures tumble, sometimes alone, sometimes tangled together, hitting hedgerows, rooftops, and fields with brutal force. These were not phantoms or tricks. These were soldiers, alive, armed, and landing where they were never meant to be. The Atlantic Wall, proud and massive, suddenly felt irrelevant. As staff officers gathered, their faces pale in lamplight, the general tried to impose order. He demanded numbers, locations, anything solid. 13,000. One officer whispered, repeating information intercepted from multiple sectors. 13,000 Allied paratroopers. The number struck him harder than artillery. 13,000 men did not drop by accident. 13,000 men meant intention, confidence, and an enemy willing to gamble everything on shock and speed. He imagined those soldiers stepping into darkness, trusting silk and gravity, accepting dispersion and death as the price of surprise. The general's mind raced through doctrine and countermeasures, but nothing fit. Rear units were scattered, trained for security, not sudden close combat. Roads twisted through hedgerows that favored ambush. Communications were already fraying, lines cut by bombs or by men who seemed to appear from nowhere. Reports mentioned soldiers speaking English, firing briefly, then vanishing again, leaving only confusion behind. The general felt as though the ground itself had become hostile, every shadow capable of hiding an enemy. He had prepared for assault from the sea, not invasion from the stars. He ordered reserves to move, then halted them when new reports suggested enemy presence along those very routes. Each decision seemed to collide with another fragment of bad news. A bridge was taken, a crossroads contested, a gun battery silenced without warning. The paratroopers were not massed, they were scattered, yet somehow omnipresent. That scattered presence was their strength. German units hesitated, firing at echoes, at rumors carried by frightened civilians and exhausted messengers. The general realized with a sick clarity that fear itself was now multiplying the enemy's numbers. Between orders, he returned to the window, unable to stop watching the sky. Parachutes still descended, fewer now, but persistent, like punctuation marks added relentlessly to a sentence already complete. Each one represented a man who had crossed an invisible line, who had arrived behind the wall without permission, without invitation. The wall had been designed to be faced, to be challenged head-on. It had never been designed to be ignored. The general clenched his jaw, feeling the insult as much as the danger. Strategy was being rewritten overhead. His thoughts drifted, unwillingly, to Berlin, to confident assurances and rigid plans. He had accepted them, believed them, even defended them in meetings. Now those assurances seemed distant, almost childish. The war had always punished certainty, but rarely so brutally. He imagined explaining this night to superiors who would demand reasons and scapegoats. What explanation could suffice for an enemy who refused to play by expected rules? He suspected none would be accepted. Failure, once visible, rarely tolerated nuance. As dawn approached, the darkness lightened to a bruised grey. Smoke hung low over fields and villages, blurring the edges of the world. With light came clarity, and with clarity, dread. The general could now see the Atlantic wall's guns firing seaward, obedient and magnificent, while chaos reigned behind them. The contrast felt obscene. Concrete and steel roared with purpose, yet men fought and died in hedgerows the wall was meant to protect. The realization settled heavily. The defense had been bypassed, not broken. An exhausted lieutenant reported in person, mud on his boots, fear in his eyes. Enemy soldiers had been encountered in small groups, aggressive and confident despite isolation. They attacked, withdrew, attacked again, never allowing a clear picture to form. The general listened, nodding, feeling older with every sentence. He asked about prisoners, about uniforms, about insignia, clinging to details as anchors. The answers only deepened the unease. These men knew their objectives, even when scattered. They adapted faster than expected. They improvised. As the sun finally crested the horizon, burning away the last shadows, the general stood again. The sky was empty now. The dropping finished. What remained was the aftermath, scattered across fields and villages, stitched into the fabric of Normandy. He understood, with grim certainty, that this was only the beginning. The paratroopers had opened a door that could not be closed. Whatever happened on the beaches, whatever reports arrived next, the war behind the Atlantic wall would never return to its previous shape. The sky had chosen its side, and the general knew he would remember this morning for the rest of his life. By full daylight, the illusion of control had vanished, replaced by a grinding sense that the battlefield was no longer a place, but a condition. The general moved from room to room as reports filtered in, each one sharpening the same truth from a different angle. German units were encountering enemy soldiers everywhere and nowhere at once. A patrol sent to investigate a supposed landing zone returned shaken, having fired at figures that vanished into hedgerows before contact could be confirmed. Another patrol never returned at all. Roads that had been secure hours earlier now felt dangerous, as if the land itself had learned how to ambush. Telephone lines crackled with partial messages, voices breaking as connections failed. The general listened carefully, forcing himself to hear past panic and exaggeration. A battery commander reported his guns silenced by small arms fire from behind, the attackers appearing suddenly, shouting orders in accented German before grenades detonated among the crews. A bridge guard unit claimed to have repelled an attack, only to later discover that the enemy had already crossed elsewhere and cut their withdrawal route. Each story was different, yet all described the same phenomenon. Allied paratroopers exploiting surprise and uncertainty with ruthless efficiency. He gathered his senior officers and spoke slowly, deliberately, emphasizing discipline over speed. Rash movements would only feed the chaos. Yet as he spoke, he saw doubt in their eyes, not about his authority, but about the situation itself. The traditional markers of a front line were gone. There was no clear direction to face, no single axis of advance to block. The Atlantic Wall's massive guns continued to thunder toward the sea, obeying their purpose. But inland, the fight had become intimate and disorienting. The general authorized local commanders to act independently if communications failed, a decision that felt like surrendering a piece of himself. Decentralization was dangerous, yet clinging to centralized control in this environment would be fatal. He thought of the Allied paratroopers again, scattered yet autonomous, each small group empowered to act. In granting similar freedom to his own officers, he was forced to acknowledge the effectiveness of the enemy's approach. The realization stung, but pragmatism outweighed pride. As the hours passed, the scale of the drop became clearer. 13,000 men had not landed as a single force, but as countless fragments, each fragment capable of inflicting damage disproportionate to its size. The general studied fresh maps, marked with red and blue pencil, noting how even false reports forced German units to divert. A rumor of paratroopers near a crossroads could tie down a battalion for hours. Fear, he realized, was now an Allied asset. Mid-morning brought confirmation of Allied landings on the beaches. The news did not surprise him. It merely completed the picture. The paratroopers were the opening act. The blade slipped between ribs before the hammer fell. He felt a grim respect for the coordination required, even as he issued orders to counter it. Units were instructed to form strongpoints around key roads and bridges, to move cautiously, to expect contact everywhere. The language of the orders reflected the reality. Uncertainty was now assumed. He received a personal report from a colonel who had encountered paratroopers firsthand. They were aggressive, the colonel said, confident even when outnumbered. They attacked supply columns, destroyed vehicles, then melted away. Some wore smeared camouflage on their faces, making them appear almost inhuman in the half-light. The general listened, imagining young men driven by training and adrenaline, clinging to mission objectives while isolated deep in enemy territory. He wondered how many of them understood the larger picture, or whether they fought simply because stopping would mean death. The general's own fatigue crept in unnoticed until his hands began to ache. He had been awake for too long, his body protesting even as his mind raced. Coffee no longer helped. He forced himself to eat a piece of bread, tasting nothing. Outside, wounded soldiers were being brought in, their stories overlapping into a chorus of confusion. Each described sudden contact, close-range fire, enemies who seemed to appear from the ground itself. None described a conventional battle. At noon, a staff officer reported that several coastal units were requesting permission to withdraw slightly to address threats to their rear. The general hesitated. Granting withdrawal risked weakening the wall at the moment of main assault. Denying it risked encirclement and collapse. He chose compromise, authorizing limited adjustments while emphasizing the priority of holding beach positions. It felt like balancing on a blade. Every decision now carried consequences that could not be fully seen. As afternoon wore on, the generals sensed a shift. The initial shock was giving way to a grinding contest of endurance. Paratroopers who had survived the landing were running low on ammunition, food, and cohesion. German forces, once paralyzed, were beginning to adapt, forming ad hoc groups, probing cautiously. Yet adaptation came at a cost. Time lost could not be regained, and every delay favored the expanding Allied foothold on the coast. He walked outside briefly, standing in the sun, listening to distant artillery. The sound was constant, a reminder that the invasion was no longer a question, but a fact. He thought of the Atlantic Wall again, of its concrete certainty, and felt an almost physical ache at its inadequacy. The wall had been designed to repel force, not to counter audacity. Audacity, he now understood, was harder to defend against than firepower. Night fell again, bringing with it the possibility of renewed drops, renewed chaos. The general braced himself, issuing orders for heightened vigilance. He knew sleep would be impossible. Somewhere out there, paratroopers were still moving, still fighting, still shaping events far beyond their numbers. He felt the weight of the day settle into memory, already certain that historians would dissect these hours with cold clarity. Living through them, however, was another matter entirely. Night returned with a deceptive calm, the kind that suggested rest but delivered only tension stretched thin. The general remained at his desk, lamp casting a tight circle of light over maps that no longer reflected reality. The day's chaos had hardened into a grim pattern. The paratroopers were no longer just falling from the sky. They were embedded in the landscape, clinging to hedgerows, barns, ditches, and crossroads like burrs that refused to be shaken loose. Reports came slower now, not because fighting had ceased, but because communication itself had become an obstacle course. Couriers risked ambush with every kilometer. Radios crackled, then went dead. Silence became as meaningful as noise. He leaned back briefly, closing his eyes, only to see drifting parachutes again, ghostly shapes descending through darkness. The image refused to fade. It was not fear that haunted him, but recognition. He recognized that something fundamental had shifted, that the war he had trained for was slipping away, replaced by a version governed less by mass and more by momentum. The enemy had seized momentum in the air, and gravity itself had done the rest. A knock broke his thoughts. Another officer entered, helmet under his arm, face drawn tight. He spoke of skirmishes continuing through the night, of paratroopers fighting in ones and twos, refusing surrender, refusing to retreat, even when isolated. They fought, the officer said, like men who believed relief would come, because in time it would. The general nodded slowly. Faith in reinforcement was a powerful weapon. His own men, by contrast, felt surrounded even when they were not. Outside, flares burst sporadically, staining the sky white, then red, then fading. Each flare revealed fragments of the countryside, frozen in harsh light, a tree line, a ruined wall, a road suddenly empty. Somewhere out there, men waited in those shadows, counting heartbeats, listening for boots, fingers tight on triggers. The general understood that this kind of fighting devoured nerves. It rewarded patience and punished certainty. It turned training into instinct, and instinct into survival. As midnight passed, the broader shape of events began to emerge. Allied forces on the beaches were pushing inland, slowly, painfully, but relentlessly. The paratroopers' presence behind the lines had done its work. German units hesitated at crucial moments, delayed by threats that might be real or imagined. Bridges blown, roads blocked, orders questioned. Each small disruption compounded into something larger. The general felt the weight of inevitability pressing down, not as a sudden collapse, but as a steady, suffocating pressure. He drafted a message to higher command, careful with his words. He described the situation honestly but without despair, emphasizing resistance, counterattacks, opportunities still available. Yet between the lines lay the truth. The initiative had been lost in the first hours, when the sky filled with falling men. He knew how such messages were received, filtered through layers of expectation and denial. Still, he sent it. Duty demanded no less. In the early hours before dawn, fatigue finally claimed him in fragments. He dozed, sitting upright, waking at every sound, every raised voice. Dreams blended with reality. In one moment he was back at a training ground, reviewing fortifications. In the next, he was standing beneath a sky raining soldiers. When he woke fully, his uniform felt heavier, as if soaked with the hours he had not truly slept. Morning arrived grey and cold. The second day of the invasion dawned without ceremony. The general stood by the window again, watching mist lift from the fields. Smoke rose in thin columns where fighting had burned through the night. Somewhere, artillery fired, methodical and distant. The paratroopers were no longer an abstract threat. They were part of the ground now, entwined with it, impossible to separate cleanly. New reports confirmed what he already suspected. Allied airborne units were linking up with forces from the beaches. What had begun as isolated drops was becoming a connected front. The window for decisive counteraction had narrowed to a slit, then closed. The general felt a quiet resignation settle in, not surrender, but acceptance. Acceptance that this battle, this moment, would not bend back to the old rules. He walked outside, boots crunching on gravel, and looked toward the west, where the sea lay beyond the horizon. The Atlantic wall stood between that sea and the land, battered but standing, its guns scarred but defiant. Yet behind it, the war had already flowed around, like water finding a crack. He understood then that walls, no matter how strong, were only answers to the last question asked. The enemy had asked a new one. A young soldier passed nearby, eyes hollow, rifle clutched tight. The general watched him go, thinking of the paratroopers again. Many no older, many likely already dead. Strategy reduced them to numbers and arrows on maps, but here, in the open air, the cost was visible in every exhausted face. The realization did not soften his resolve, but it deepened it. War was not just movement and counter-movement. It was the sum of countless human moments colliding. By midday, confirmation arrived that the Allies had secured significant inland positions. The general convened his remaining staff. Their discussions were quieter now, more focused. There was no pretense of restoring yesterday's situation. The task was to slow, to bleed, to buy time. He issued orders accordingly, aware that each hour gained mattered beyond this battlefield. Even in retreat or delay, there was purpose. As the meeting ended, the general lingered alone. He felt older than he had days before. History, he knew, would remember this invasion as a turning point, measured in beaches and names etched into memory. Few would remember the sky at dawn, the moment when the impossible became undeniable. Yet that was where the balance had tipped, silently, above sleeping fields. Late in the afternoon, he received one final report that stayed with him. A small group of paratroopers, cut off since the first night, had continued to fight until overwhelmed. When ammunition ran out, they destroyed their radios and maps. They had held a crossroads longer than expected, delaying a column at a critical moment. The general read the report twice, then set it aside. He felt no anger reading it, only a heavy respect. Those men had done exactly what they were meant to do. Long after the guns fell silent and the maps were archived, that truth would remain. On D-Day, behind the Atlantic Wall, the war was not decided by concrete or cannons, but by 13,000 men who trusted the dark, stepped into the void, and changed history before their boots ever touched the ground.